The static crackled through her headset at 0347 hours, but it wasn't the usual interference from the mountain peaks. Sarah Chun pressed the earpiece closer, her fingers instinctively adjusting the frequency dial with the precision of someone who had spent countless nights listening to the electronic whispers that danced between the valleys. In the dim glow of her equipment panel, the green phosphor displays painted her face in an otherworldly light, each blinking LED telling a story that only she seemed to understand. Forward Operating Base Millfield sat like a concrete island in an ocean of snow-covered ridges, its perimeter lights barely visible through the swirling blizzard that had descended 3 hours earlier. The weather had turned the Hindu Kush foothills into a white maze where visibility dropped to mere yards, and the howling wind made every shadow a potential threat. Inside the communications bunker, 12 feet below ground level, Sarah worked. Alone in the kind of silence that comes when the world above has been muffled by nature's fury. She had been monitoring the frequencies for 6 hours straight, her coffee growing cold in the thermos beside her elbow when the pattern emerged. Not words, not voices, but something far more dangerous, the systematic testing of their communication. Channels, someone was probing their defenses, learning their radio protocols, mapping their response times. The interference wasn't random weather static. It was deliberate, calculated, and getting stronger. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had been assigned to the night shift communications desk for 8 months, ever since the incident that nobody talked about, but everyone remembered. The brass had been clear: monitor the channels, relay messages, file reports. Nothing more, nothing less. She was furniture in the military machine, a warm body to keep the radios alive when the rest of the base slept. At least that's what Sergeant Jake Thompson had told her during orientation, his weathered face creased with the kind of dismissive smile reserved for personnel who had fallen from grace. The communications bunker had become her world, a cramped concrete box filled with banks of radio equipment, signal processors, and encryption devices that hummed with electronic life. 3 computer monitors glowed in the darkness, displaying frequency spectrums, message traffic, and tactical maps that updated in real time. She knew every switch, every dial, every warning light by heart. The HF radio crackled with distant voices from Thunder Base, the main command center 4 hours away by helicopter, while the VHF channels carried the routine chatter of perimeter guards checking in from their posts around the base. Lieutenant Marcus Rivera had taken command of Forward Operating Base Millfield 6 months ago, fresh from West Point with brass buttons that still gleamed and a confidence that hadn't yet been tempered by the reality of mountain warfare. He visited the communications bunker once a week, usually to review message logs or update communication protocols, but his eyes never lingered on Sarah's station. She was part of the equipment, necessary but unremarkable, like the backup generators or the water purification system. Tonight felt different. The static patterns she was hearing didn't match any natural phenomena she had encountered during her months in the mountains. The interference came in waves, each one slightly different from the last, as if someone were methodically testing different frequencies and power levels. She pulled up the spectrum analyzer on her center monitor, watching the electronic snow dance across the screen in patterns that would have looked random to most observers. The base housed 150 personnel, ranging from infantry soldiers to intelligence analysts, all tasked with monitoring the porous border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Their mission was straightforward: gather information, report suspicious activity, and maintain a visible presence in a region where loyalties shifted like sand in the wind. The concrete structures and razor wire perimeter gave the illusion of security, but Sarah knew that in these mountains, safety was always temporary. Captain Amy Foster commanded the artillery unit, 3 mortar and a handful of soldiers who could rain steel on any position within 5 kilometers of the base. Had combat experience from 2 previous deployments, and her no-nonsense attitude had earned the respect of everyone under her command. Foster occasionally stopped by the communications bunker to coordinate fire support exercises, but she regarded Sarah with the same polite indifference as the rest of the command staff. Private Tony Martinez was different. The young soldier from Texas had been assigned to the communications team 2 months ago, working the day shift while Sarah covered the nights. He asked questions, wanted to understand how the equipment worked, and seemed genuinely interested in the technical aspects of their job. More importantly, he listened when Sarah pointed out irregularities in the radio traffic, even if he didn't always understand the implications. The blizzard intensified outside, and Sarah could hear the wind howling through the ventilation system. The base's generator provided steady power, but the storm was playing havoc with their satellite communications. She switched to the backup antenna array, manually adjusting the directional settings to compensate for the weather interference. The process required patience and skill, qualities that her supervisors took for granted but rarely acknowledged. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she didn't dare leave her post to refill it. The interference patterns were becoming more complex, more organized. Whatever was happening out there in the storm, it wasn't random. She began recording the signals, capturing the electronic signatures on her digital storage system. If her suspicions were correct, these recordings would be crucial evidence of what was about to unfold. The tactical map on her left monitor showed the base's position relative to the surrounding terrain. Forward Operating Base Millfield sat in a valley surrounded by ridges that rose 3,000 feet on all sides. The single-access road wound through a narrow pass that could be easily blocked, and the helicopter landing zone was the only other. Way in or out. In clear weather, the elevated position provided excellent observation of the surrounding area. In a blizzard, it became a trap. Sarah's fingers moved across the radio controls with practiced efficiency, fine-tuning the receivers to isolate the suspicious signals from the background noise. She had learned these techniques during her previous assignment, before the incident that had resulted in her demotion and transfer to this remote posting. The skills remained sharp, even if the official recognition had been stripped away. The perimeter guards checked in every 30 minutes, their voices crackling through the static as they reported from Alpha, Beta, Charlie, and Delta positions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sergeant Rodriguez at Alpha Post complained about the wind, while Corporal Kim at Beta Post mentioned that the thermal imaging system was having trouble penetrating the snow. The routine reports painted a picture of soldiers hunkered down against the storm, their attention focused on staying warm rather than watching for threats. At 0412 hours, the pattern changed. The interference suddenly stopped, leaving the frequencies eerily quiet. Sarah leaned forward, adjusting her headset and scanning across the radio spectrum. The silence was more ominous than the static had been, like the calm before a thunderstorm. She opened a direct channel to the command center, her hand hovering over the microphone. The silence stretched for 7 minutes. Then, faintly, she heard voices speaking in Pashto, the local dialect that most of the base personnel couldn't understand. The transmission was brief, encrypted, and came from somewhere in the mountains surrounding the base. Sarah's pulse quickened as she recognized the tactical terminology hidden within the conversation. They were discussing positions, timing, and assault routes. She began triangulating the source of the transmissions, using the base's direction finding equipment to pinpoint the locations of the radio operators. The signals were coming from multiple positions, scattered across the ridgeline that overlooked the base. Her worst fears were being confirmed. They were surrounded. The command center was quiet at this hour, staffed only by a skeleton crew of Duty personnel who monitored the tactical situation displays and maintained communication with higher headquarters. Lieutenant Rivera was asleep in his quarters, as were most of the senior staff. The base operated on a reduced alert posture during the storm, assuming that the weather would deter any potential attackers. Sarah's training kicked in as she began documenting the enemy communications. She recorded the frequencies, estimated the number of operators, and plotted their approximate locations on her tactical map. The picture that emerged was terrifying. At least 12 radio operators positioned around the base, coordinating what appeared to be a large-scale assault. The enemy had used the storm as cover to move into position, and they were preparing to strike. She reached for the emergency alert button that would wake the entire base, but hesitated. Protocol required her to notify Sergeant Thompson first, who would then alert the command staff. But Thompson was asleep in the barracks, and rousing him would take precious minutes. The enemy transmissions were increasing in frequency, suggesting that the attack was imminent. The radio crackled again, this time with a different voice speaking in accented English. The transmission was brief but clear. "Wolfpack, this is Wolf Leader. Phase 1 complete. Begin Phase 2 on my signal." Sarah's blood ran cold. Wolfpack was obviously the enemy call sign, and they were about to execute the next phase of their plan. She grabbed her logbook and began writing furiously, documenting everything she had heard and observed. The timestamps, frequencies, and estimated locations would be crucial intelligence for whoever survived the coming assault. Her hand shook slightly as she wrote, not from fear, but from the adrenaline surge that came with the realization that she was the only person on the base who understood what was happening. The storm continued to rage outside, masking the sounds of movement in the mountains. Sarah strained to hear any indication of the enemy's approach, but the wind and snow created a wall of white noise that could hide an army. She switched to the base's external security cameras, but the feeds showed nothing but swirling snow and the occasional glimpse of a fence post or guard tower. Her training told her to follow protocol, to alert the chain of command and let the senior officers make the tactical decisions. But her experience whispered a different message. Sometimes the person closest to the information had to act first, even if it meant exceeding their authority. The enemy was counting on the base's rigid procedures and reduced alertness during the storm. They expected their attack to come as a complete surprise. Sarah made her decision. She opened the emergency broadcast channel and keyed the microphone, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. The words that came next would either save the base or end her military career, but there was no time to consider the consequences. Outside in the howling darkness, Wolfpack was preparing to close the trap. The green glow of her radio displays reflected in her eyes as she prepared to speak the words that would change everything. In the mountains above, enemy forces were moving through the storm, confident that their approach had gone undetected. They had no idea that the quiet woman in the communications bunker had been listening to their every word, documenting their movements, and preparing to turn their surprise attack into a deadly miscalculation. The static returned to the frequencies. But now Sarah understood it for what it really was, the electronic signature of a coordinated assault about to begin. She had minutes, maybe less, before the first shots were fired. The fate of 150 soldiers rested in her hands, and the radio that had made her invisible was about to make her the most important person on forward Operating Base Millfield. The emergency channel crackled to life at 0418 hours, cutting through the storm's static like a blade through silk. Sarah's voice emerged from speakers throughout the base, calm and measured despite the chaos she was about to unleash. "Command, this is communications. We have multiple hostile transmissions on tactical frequencies. Enemy forces are coordinating assault positions around our perimeter. This is not a drill." The words hung in the air for 3 heartbeats before the base exploded into motion. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in red, and the general alarm began its harsh electronic wail. Boots thundered against concrete as personnel rushed from their quarters, grabbing weapons and equipment with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had drilled for this moment but never expected it to come. During a blizzard, Lieutenant Rivera burst into the communications bunker, still buttoning his uniform jacket, his face a mask of confusion and barely controlled panic. Behind him came Sergeant Thompson, his weathered features twisted with anger at being awakened by what he clearly considered a false alarm. Captain Foster arrived moments later, her artillery training evident in the way she moved with purpose despite the chaos surrounding them. "What exactly did you hear?" Rivera demanded, his voice cracking, slightly under the pressure of his first real crisis as base commander. The West Point training that had seemed so comprehensive in the classroom felt inadequate in the face of Sarah's measured report about enemy radio traffic and coordinated assault positions. Sarah turned from her radio console, her hands still working the frequency controls as she spoke. 12 distinct radio operators speaking in Pashto and English, coordinating movement around our perimeter. They're using tactical terminology, discussing phase transitions and assault timing. The transmissions began approximately 40 minutes ago with systematic frequency testing. Thompson stepped forward, his skepticism written across his face in deep furrows. "Chun, you're telling me you've been monitoring enemy communications for 40 minutes, and you're just now reporting it? That's a serious breach of protocol. You should have alerted the duty officer immediately." "I was confirming the threat." "Assessment," Sarah replied, her voice steady as she continued adjusting the radio equipment. "Random chatter is common in these mountains. Coordinated tactical communications are not. I needed to verify the pattern before declaring an emergency." Foster moved to the tactical display, studying the positions Sarah had marked on the digital map. "These locations you've plotted, how accurate are they? My mortar teams need precise coordinates if we're going to provide effective fire support." Sarah's fingers danced across the direction-finding controls, fine-tuning the bearing measurements that would determine whether the base's defensive fire was accurate or futile. "The triangulation is accurate within 50 meters. I've been tracking their movement patterns for the past 20 minutes. They're positioned on the high ground, overlooking all our defensive positions." The storm outside intensified, and the lights flickered as the generator struggled against the wind's assault on the power lines. Rivera grabbed the command radio, his voice tight with the strain of command decisions he had never been trained to make under these conditions. "Thunder. Base, this is Outpost Charlie. We have multiple enemy contacts surrounding our position. Request immediate air support and reinforcement." The response was immediate and devastating. "Outpost Charlie, this is Thunder Base. All aircraft are grounded due to weather conditions. No reinforcement possible until storm passes. Estimated time to clear weather, 6 hours minimum. You are on your own." The silence that followed was deafening. 150 soldiers, trapped in a concrete box surrounded by mountains, with no possibility of escape or reinforcement. Rivera's face went pale as the weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. The theoretical scenarios from his military academy training had never included being completely cut off during a coordinated enemy assault. Thompson grabbed Sarah's shoulder, his grip tighter than necessary. "Are you absolutely certain about these intercepts? Because if you're wrong, you've just put this entire base on high alert for nothing. And if you're right, you should have reported it the moment you heard the first suspicious transmission." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "I'm certain. The enemy is using standard Taliban tactical radio procedures, modified for this specific terrain. They've been planning this assault for weeks, using the storm as cover for their final positioning. We have maybe 10 minutes before they attack." Foster was already on her radio, coordinating with her mortar teams. "Battery 1, this is fire control. Prepare for immediate fire mission. Enemy targets on the ridgeline, coordinates to follow. We're about to get hit hard, and we need to break up their assault before they can coordinate their attack. The base transformed around them as soldiers took their positions. The mess hall emptied as personnel rushed to their assigned defensive posts. The armory became a hive of activity as weapons were distributed and ammunition was carried to the perimeter guard positions. The medical bay prepared for casualties, while the communications bunker became the nerve center for the desperate defense that was about to unfold. Rivera struggled to maintain command presence as reports flooded in from the perimeter guards. Alpha Post reports movement in the tree line. Beta Post has lost thermal imaging due to weather interference. Charlie Post requests permission to illuminate the perimeter with flares. Each report painted a picture of soldiers peering into a white void, trying to spot enemies who could be anywhere in the swirling darkness. Sarah continued monitoring the enemy frequencies, her training allowing her to follow multiple conversations. Simultaneously, the Taliban forces were executing a textbook assault, using the storm to mask their approach while coordinating their attack through encrypted radio communications. Their commander, the voice she had identified as Wolf Leader, was methodically checking with each position, ensuring that all elements were ready for the synchronized assault. "They're moving into final positions," she reported, her voice cutting through the chaos in the bunker. "Wolf Leader is conducting final communications checks. The assault will begin within 5 minutes." Thompson's skepticism crumbled as the reality of the situation became undeniable. "How many are we facing? Can you get an accurate count from their radio traffic?" Sarah closed her eyes, concentrating on the overlapping voices in her headset. "Minimum 200 fighters, possibly more. They're organized into 12 assault teams, each with a designated radio operator. Standard Taliban cell structure, but with better coordination than we usually see. Someone with significant military experience is running this operation." Foster's mortar opened fire, their deep thumps echoing through the bunker as high explosive rounds arced through the storm toward the enemy positions. The first shells impacted with bright flashes that illuminated the swirling snow, creating momentary glimpses of the surrounding terrain. The counter-battery fire began immediately, enemy mortar responding with their own deadly rain of steel. The base shuddered as the first enemy rounds impacted, concrete dust raining from the ceiling as the structure absorbed the shock waves. Emergency lighting flickered, and the radio equipment sparked as power surges coursed through the electrical system. Sarah's hands moved instinctively to protect her equipment, ensuring that the communication links remained operational despite the bombardment. Rivera's voice cracked as he tried to coordinate the defense. "All posts, this is command. Enemy assault is imminent. Weapons free, engage any movement outside the perimeter. Medical teams stand by for casualties. Engineering teams prepare for breaches in the perimeter defenses." The attack began with a coordinated assault on all 4 sides of the base. Automatic weapons fire erupted from the ridgelines, muzzle flashes winking through the storm like deadly fireflies. The perimeter guards returned fire, their weapons adding to the cacophony of combat that drowned out even the howling wind. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked through the darkness, their explosions marking the beginning of the most desperate fight that forward Operating Base Millfield had ever faced. Sarah's radio crackled with panicked voices as the perimeter positions reported enemy contact. "Alpha Post is under heavy fire. We have multiple casualties." Beta Post reports zappers approaching the wire. "Charlie Post is being overrun. Request immediate support." The defensive positions that had seemed so secure during peacetime were crumbling under the coordinated assault. Thompson grabbed the emergency radio, his previous skepticism replaced by grim determination. "All available. Personnel to the perimeter. This is not a drill. We are under attack by a superior force, and we need every rifle on the line." The communications bunker shook as a rocket-propelled grenade exploded near the entrance, showering the interior with concrete fragments. Emergency power kicked in as the main electrical system failed, bathing the equipment in the red glow of backup lighting. Sarah's radios flickered but remained operational, their electronic heartbeat the only link between the embattled base and the outside world. Foster's voice came through the command radio, strained with the effort of coordinating defensive fire while under direct attack. Fire control to command. Enemy forces are advancing on all sides. My mortar teams are engaging multiple targets, but we're running low on ammunition. We need resupply immediately. Rivera looked around the bunker, his face pale in the emergency lighting. The young officer who had arrived 6 months ago with dreams of successful command was facing the reality of combat leadership under impossible circumstances. His training had prepared him for many things, but not for being completely cut off and outnumbered 4-1 by a coordinated enemy assault. "How long can we hold?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the sounds of battle. Sarah's fingers continued working the radio controls, monitoring the enemy communications that revealed their tactical intentions. "They're preparing for a final assault. Wolf leader is coordinating a concentrated push on the eastern perimeter. They believe they can breach our defenses within the next 20 minutes. The battle raged outside as the storm provided cover for both sides. The Taliban fighters used the limited visibility to advance closer to the perimeter, while the base's defenders struggled to identify targets in the swirling snow. Tracer rounds created brief streaks of light through the darkness, marking the deadly exchange of fire that would determine whether anyone at forward Operating Base Millfield would see the sunrise. Thompson worked frantically to establish communication with other military units in the region, hoping to coordinate some form of assistance despite the weather conditions. Any station, this is Outpost Charlie. We are under attack by superior forces and require immediate assistance. Our position is being overrun." The responses were uniformly discouraging. Other bases were dealing with their own weather-related emergencies. Aircraft remained grounded, and the mountain passes were impassable due to the blizzard. Forward Operating Base Millfield was truly alone, with only its own resources and the determination of its defenders standing between survival and annihilation. Foster's artillery continued to fire, but the ammunition supply was dwindling rapidly. Each mortar round was precious, and the targets were becoming harder to identify as the enemy adapted their tactics to the defensive fire. The Taliban fighters were displaying a level of coordination and discipline that spoke of extensive training and experienced leadership. Sarah intercepted another transmission from Wolf leader, his voice confident as he coordinated the final phase of the assault. "All units, this is Wolf leader. Phase 3 is now in effect. Concentrate fire on the eastern perimeter. Breach teams advance on my signal. Victory is within our grasp." The enemy mortar intensified their bombardment, focusing on the communications bunker and command center. The concrete structure groaned under the impact of high explosive rounds, and cracks appeared in the walls as the building's structural integrity was tested beyond its design limits. Emergency equipment sparked and failed as power surges overwhelmed the electrical system. Rivera grabbed Sarah's arm, his desperation evident in his grip. "Is there any way to call for help? Any frequency we haven't tried? Any unit that might be able to assist us?" Sarah looked at the young officer, seeing the fear and determination warring in his eyes. The weight of command was crushing him, but he was still trying to save his soldiers. She made a decision that would change everything, reaching for a radio frequency that she had hoped never to use again. "There might be one option," she said quietly, her fingers moving to a secured channel that wasn't listed in any of the base's communication protocols. "But it will require explaining some things about my background that aren't in my official personnel file." The battle outside reached a crescendo as the Taliban fighters launched their final assault. The eastern perimeter erupted in gunfire as enemy forces attempted to breach the defensive positions. The fate of forward operating base Millfield hung in the balance, and the quiet woman at the radio console was about to reveal why she had been assigned to monitor communications instead of leading them. The secured frequency hummed to life with a different quality than the standard military channels, its encryption protocols more sophisticated than anything forward operating base Millfield was supposed to possess. Sarah's fingers moved across the radio controls with the precision of someone who had used this equipment before, in places where such communications meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Lieutenant Rivera watched in growing confusion as Sarah accessed channels that didn't appear on any of the base's frequency allocation charts. The radio equipment responded to her touch like a familiar instrument, revealing capabilities that the official technical manuals had never mentioned. Her movements were fluid, confident, and spoke of training that went far beyond what a standard communications operator would receive. "Chun, what frequency is that?" Sergeant Thompson demanded, his voice tight with suspicion as he watched the encrypted channel come online. "That's not in any of our communications protocols." "Where did you learn to access that system?" Sarah's response was interrupted by another barrage of enemy mortar fire, the explosions walking closer to the communications bunker as the Taliban gunners adjusted their aim. The concrete walls shuddered, and dust cascaded from the ceiling as the structure absorbed the impact of high explosive rounds designed to penetrate hardened positions. Emergency lighting flickered, casting eerie shadows across the banks of radio equipment. "Phantom Base. This is Ghost 7 requesting immediate priority override." Sarah spoke into the microphone, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to transform her from the quiet night shift operator into someone entirely different. "Authentication code Sierra Whiskey 77 Alpha. We have a code black situation requiring immediate intervention." The response came through crystal clear despite the storm interference that was degrading all other communications. "Ghost 7, this is Phantom Base. We show you as inactive status. Confirm your current situation and location." Rivera and Thompson exchanged glances, both men recognizing that they were witnessing something far beyond their security clearance. The professional terminology, the authentication codes, and the immediate response from a facility that didn't officially exist painted a picture of Sarah Chun that bore no resemblance to the quiet radio operator they thought they knew. "Phantom Base, Ghost 7 is currently assigned to forward operating base Millfield. Grid reference 7-7-9er-4-2-1. We are under assault by approximately 200 enemy fighters using coordinated tactical communications. Base is cut off, no reinforcement possible due to weather conditions. Estimated time to overrun, 30 minutes. The silence that followed stretched for nearly 15 seconds, broken only by the sound of automatic weapons fire echoing through the bunker's ventilation system. When the response came, it carried a weight that made everyone in the communications bunker stop what they were doing. "Ghost 7, confirm your identity. State your real name and previous assignment." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, Rivera saw something that made his blood run cold. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by the kind of calm focus that came from years of operating in situations where hesitation meant death. Her entire posture had changed, her voice gaining a tone of command that made his own leadership training seem inadequate. "Phantom Base, this is Major Sarah Chun, formerly assigned to Special Operations Task Force Dragon. I am currently operating under deep cover assignment at Forward Operating Base Millfield. My cover is blown, and I am requesting immediate tactical support for the defense of this position." The words hit the bunker like a physical blow. Thompson's face went white as he processed the implications of what he had just heard. The woman he had dismissed as a demoted communications operator was a major in special operations, someone whose real rank was 2 levels above his own. Foster, monitoring the conversation from her position near the tactical display, looked as if she had been struck by lightning. Rivera's voice cracked as he tried to process the revelation. "You're a major? You've been here for 8 months, and you're actually a major in special operations." Sarah's attention remained focused on the radio as Phantom Base responded. "Ghost 7, we confirm your identity and assignment. Stand by for tactical support. Coordination. Be advised, weather conditions are limiting our options, but we are implementing emergency protocols for your situation." The enemy assault intensified as Taliban fighters pressed closer to the perimeter, their coordinated attack showing the kind of discipline that came from extensive training and experienced leadership. Sarah monitored their communications while simultaneously coordinating with the mysterious Phantom Base, her ability to handle multiple complex tasks revealing training that went far beyond standard military communications procedures. "Major Chun," Rivera said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what is your real mission here? Why were you assigned to monitor our communications?" Sarah's response was interrupted by Captain Foster's urgent voice over the command radio. "Command, this is fire control. Eastern perimeter is about to be breached. We're down to our last dozen mortar rounds, and the enemy is massing for a final assault. We need immediate reinforcement, or we're going to lose this position." The sound of small arms fire grew closer as the Taliban fighters advanced through the storm, using the limited visibility to approach the base's defensive positions. The perimeter guards were fighting desperately, but their ammunition was running low and their positions were being systematically destroyed by enemy fire. Sarah keyed the radio to Phantom Base, her voice urgent but controlled. "Phantom Base, Ghost 7, enemy assault is imminent. I need immediate authorization to reveal tactical intelligence to local commanders. Lives are at stake and conventional defense is failing. Ghost 7, you are authorized to reveal necessary tactical intelligence to preserve your cover assignment. Maintain operational security regarding Task Force Dragon activities. Support assets are being deployed despite weather conditions." Thompson grabbed Sarah's arm, his grip desperate. "Major, if you have intelligence that can help us defend this base, you need to share it now. My soldiers are dying out there, and we're about to be overrun." Sarah turned to face the senior staff gathered in the bunker, her expression grave as she prepared to reveal information that would change their understanding of the entire situation. "The enemy force attacking us isn't a random Taliban cell. They're a specially trained unit that has been planning this assault for months. I've been monitoring their communications and mapping their network for the past 8 months. Rivera's face went pale as the implications sank in. "You mean this entire attack is because they discovered your real identity?" "No," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "They don't know who I am, but they know this base has been gathering intelligence on their operations. My mission was to identify their leadership structure and communication methods. What I discovered is that they're not just local fighters. They're being directed by someone with advanced military training, possibly a former officer from a regular army." The communications equipment sparked as another mortar round impacted near the bunker, and Sarah quickly switched to backup systems to maintain contact with Phantom Base. Her movements were automatic, the result of training in environments where equipment failure meant mission failure and potentially death. Foster's voice came through the command radio, strained with the effort of coordinating defensive fire while under direct attack. "Command, Eastern perimeter is being overrun. We have multiple casualties, and the enemy is advancing on the command bunker. I need immediate reinforcement at grid reference 7-7-9-4-2-3. Sarah grabbed the tactical radio, her voice carrying the authority of her real rank as she coordinated the defense. "All units, this is actual. Concentrate fire on the eastern approach. Enemy commander is coordinating from position on the ridgeline, approximately 800 meters northeast of Alpha Post. Neutralize that position, and their coordination will collapse. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. The soldiers who had been fighting a desperate defensive action suddenly had clear tactical guidance from someone who understood both their capabilities and the enemy's weaknesses. Sarah's knowledge of Taliban tactics, combined with her understanding of the base's defensive systems, created a synergy that began to turn the tide of the battle. Thompson stared at her in amazement. "How do you know where their commander is positioned?" "I've been tracking their communications for 8 months," Sarah replied, her hands working multiple radio frequencies simultaneously. "I know their procedures, their call signs, and their tactical preferences. Wolf leader always positions himself where he can observe the entire battlefield while maintaining communication with his subordinate units." Rivera tried to assert his authority as base commander, but his voice lacked the confidence that Sarah's revelation had shattered. "Major, I'm still the commanding officer of this base. I need to know what other intelligence you have that could help us survive this attack." Sarah's response was interrupted by a new voice on the phantom base frequency, one that carried the unmistakable authority of senior command. "Ghost 7, this is Dragon 6. We have assets inbound to your position despite weather conditions. Maintain defensive posture for another 20 minutes. Help is coming." The sound of rotors became audible through the storm, barely perceptible over the noise of battle but growing stronger. Sarah smiled grimly as she recognized the distinctive sound signature of aircraft that weren't supposed to exist in the official order of battle. The storm that had cut off forward operating base Millfield from conventional support was about to become irrelevant. Foster's mortar had fallen silent, their ammunition exhausted. But the enemy assault was faltering as the defenders began to fight with renewed coordination. Sarah's tactical guidance had transformed a desperate last stand into an organized defense, and the Taliban fighters were discovering that their carefully planned attack was meeting unexpectedly effective resistance. "All units, this is actual," Sarah broadcast on the command frequency, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had faced similar situations before. "Enemy forces are beginning to withdraw from the northern and western approaches. Maintain fire discipline and conserve ammunition. Priority targets are the radio operators on the ridgeline." The battle was entering a new phase as the attacking forces discovered that their surprise assault had become a coordinated engagement against defenders who seemed to know their every move. The storm that had provided cover for their approach was now working against them, limiting their ability to maneuver while the base's defenders fought from prepared positions. Rivera looked around the communications bunker, seeing his base with new eyes. The quiet radio operator who had been invisible for 8 months was actually a special operations major conducting a deep cover intelligence mission. The attack that had seemed like a catastrophic surprise was actually the culmination of months of careful observation and analysis. "Major Chun," he said quietly, "when this is over, I think we need to have a very long conversation about what's really been happening at this base." Sarah's response was interrupted by the sound of explosions echoing through the mountains, different from the mortar fire that had been pounding the base. These were air-delivered ordnance, precision strikes, that were systematically destroying the enemy positions on the ridgeline. The mysterious assets that Phantom Base had promised were beginning to make their presence felt. Thompson grabbed the perimeter radio, his voice urgent as he tried to coordinate with the incoming air support. "Unknown aircraft, this is Outpost Charlie, we are friendlies in the valley position. Enemy forces are on the surrounding ridgelines." The response came through Sarah's secured channel, not the standard military frequencies. "Outpost Charlie, this is Shadow Flight. We have positive identification of your position. Maintain current defensive posture. We are engaging hostile targets on the high ground." The tide of battle was turning as the Taliban fighters found themselves caught between the base's defensive fire and precision airstrikes that seemed to anticipate their every move. The coordinated assault that had seemed unstoppable was beginning to collapse as their command structure was systematically destroyed by forces that operated beyond the conventional military hierarchy. Sarah monitored the enemy communications as their tactical network disintegrated. Wolf leader's confident voice was replaced by panicked calls for retreat as his carefully planned assault dissolved into chaos. The air support that wasn't supposed to exist was methodically destroying targets that had been identified through 8 months of patient intelligence gathering. The storm began to subside as dawn approached, revealing the aftermath of the battle that had raged through the night. The enemy forces were withdrawing through the mountain passes, their assault broken and their leadership eliminated. Forward. Operating Base Millfield had survived, but the cost had been measured in more than just ammunition and casualties. Foster entered the communications bunker, her face grim with the weight of combat command. "Major Chun, I don't know who you really are or what your mission was, but you saved this base. Without your intelligence and tactical coordination, we would have been overrun in the first hour." Sarah looked around the bunker at the faces of soldiers who had discovered that their quiet, night shift radio operator was someone entirely different from who they had thought she was. The revelation had changed everything. But the mission that had brought her to Forward Operating Base Millfield was far from over. The Tactical Operations Center at Forward Operating Base Millfield underwent a complete transformation as Major. Sarah Chun took her rightful place at the command console. Gone was the quiet radio operator who had worked the night shift in obscurity. In her place stood a seasoned special operations officer whose expertise had been forged in classified missions across 3 continents. The change was so dramatic that even seasoned soldiers like Captain Foster found themselves adjusting their posture in the presence of someone whose real authority exceeded their own. Lieutenant Rivera struggled to process the shift in command dynamics as Sarah coordinated the ongoing defense with the precision of someone who had orchestrated similar operations dozens of times before. Her knowledge of enemy tactics, combined with her understanding of the base's capabilities, created a defensive strategy that transformed their desperate last stand into a calculated engagement. The young officer who had been overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation now found himself receiving clear, actionable orders from someone whose experience dwarfed his own. "All defensive positions, this is actual," Sarah broadcast across the command frequency, her voice carrying the calm authority that comes from years of leading soldiers in combat. "Enemy forces are consolidating on the northeastern ridge for a final assault. Concentrate all available firepower on grid reference 7-7-9er-4-2-8. We have precision air support inbound in 6 minutes." The transformation in the base's defensive posture was immediate and profound. Soldiers who had been fighting isolated actions suddenly found themselves part of a coordinated defense that anticipated enemy movements and countered them with devastating effectiveness. The Taliban fighters, who had been confident in their numerical superiority and careful planning, discovered that their opponent understood their tactics better than they understood themselves. Sergeant Thompson worked frantically to re-establish communications with the scattered defensive positions, his earlier skepticism replaced by grudging respect for Sarah's tactical acumen. "Major, Alpha Post is reporting heavy casualties, but maintaining position. Beta Post has lost their heavy weapons, but is still in the fight. Charlie Post is requesting immediate medical evacuation for their wounded." Sarah's response demonstrated the kind of battlefield judgment that separated experienced commanders from those who had only studied warfare in classrooms. Negative on immediate medical evacuation. Enemy fire is too intense for casualty evacuation. At this time, have Charlie Post move their wounded to the hardened shelter and maintain defensive positions. Medical evacuation will commence once we break their assault. The sound of approaching aircraft grew louder despite the storm, and Sarah smiled grimly as she recognized the distinctive rotor, signature of helicopters that weren't listed in any official aircraft inventory. Shadow flight was arriving with the kind of precision that came from years of operating in conditions where conventional forces couldn't function. The weather that had isolated forward Operating Base Millfield from regular military support was about to become irrelevant. Captain Foster monitored the tactical display, watching as Sarah's intelligence transformed scattered enemy contacts into a coherent picture of Taliban positions and movements. "Major, how long have you been tracking this particular enemy unit? Your knowledge of their tactics and positioning is extraordinarily detailed." Sarah's fingers continued working the radio controls as she coordinated with multiple frequencies simultaneously. Task Force Dragon has been monitoring this Taliban cell for 14 months. They've been responsible for attacks on 3 other forward operating bases in this region. My mission was to identify their leadership structure and communication methods in preparation for a larger operation to neutralize the entire network. The implications of Sarah's revelation were staggering. The attack on forward operating Base Millfield wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of Taliban operations that had been under surveillance by Special Operations Forces. Sarah's presence at the base hadn't been a demotion or punishment, but a carefully planned intelligence operation that had now been compromised by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Rivera found his voice, though it carried less confidence than before. "Major, does this mean that our base was deliberately chosen as a target because of your presence here?" "No," Sarah replied, her attention split between the tactical radio and the secured channel to Phantom Base. "The Taliban cell targeted this base because of its strategic position and perceived weakness. They have no knowledge of my real identity or mission. However, the intelligence I've gathered over the past 8 months has given us a significant advantage in defending against their assault." The first explosions from Shadow Flight's air support lit up the ridgeline with brilliant flashes that illuminated the enemy positions through the storm. The precision strikes were based on target coordinates that Sarah had been developing for months, turning her intelligence gathering into devastating tactical advantage. Taliban fighters who thought they were in concealed positions discovered that their every movement had been tracked and cataloged by an opponent they had never suspected. Thompson coordinated the base's defensive fire with the incoming air support, his voice carrying new respect for Sarah's tactical guidance. "Major, your target identification is perfect. Shadow Flight is destroying enemy positions faster than they can relocate. The Taliban fighters are beginning to break formation and withdraw." The battle entered its final phase as the enemy assault collapsed under the combined pressure of coordinated defensive fire and precision airstrikes. Wolf Leader's confident voice, which had been directing the attack for hours, was replaced by panicked calls for retreat as his carefully planned assault disintegrated into chaos. The Taliban fighters who had surrounded forward Operating Base Millfield with overwhelming numbers were discovering that numerical superiority meant nothing when facing an opponent who understood their every tactic. Sarah monitored the enemy communications as their tactical network fell apart, her months of patient intelligence gathering paying dividends in the form of lives saved and positions held. "All units, this is actual. Enemy forces are withdrawing on all fronts. Maintain defensive positions and conserve ammunition. Do not pursue beyond the perimeter. We have air support maintaining overwatch." The storm began to subside as dawn approached, revealing the battlefield in the gray light of morning. The enemy forces that had seemed so overwhelming in the darkness were revealed as scattered groups of fighters retreating through the mountain passes, their assault broken and their leadership eliminated. Forward Operating Base Millfield had not only survived, but had inflicted devastating casualties on an enemy force that had expected easy victory. Foster entered the communications bunker, her face showing the exhaustion of a night spent coordinating defensive fire under impossible conditions. Major Chun, I need to ask you something. When this is over, what happens to your mission? Does Task Force Dragon extract you, or do you continue your assignment here? Sarah's response was interrupted by a transmission from Phantom Base, the encrypted channel carrying new orders that would determine the next phase of her mission. Ghost 7, this is Dragon 6. Your cover is compromised, but your mission objectives have been achieved. The intelligence you gathered has allowed us to neutralize the primary target network. Prepare for extraction at first available opportunity. The words carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate battle. Sarah's 8 months of patient intelligence gathering had been part of a larger operation that was now reaching its conclusion. The Taliban cell that had attacked forward Operating Base Millfield was apparently the final piece of a puzzle that Task Force Dragon had been assembling for over a year. Rivera looked around the communications bunker, seeing his base with completely new eyes. Major, was our entire mission here part of your cover operation? Have we been unknowingly supporting a special operations mission for the past 8 months? Your mission was legitimate, Sarah replied, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had been living a double life for months. Forward Operating Base Millfield serves an important function in border security and intelligence gathering. My presence here was an additional layer of operations that didn't interfere with your primary mission. The sound of helicopters grew louder as Shadow Flight prepared to extract casualties and provide reinforcement for the battered base. The aircraft that had provided decisive air support were now transitioning to medical evacuation and resupply, their crews working with the efficiency that came from years of operating in hostile environments. Thompson coordinated the casualty evacuation, his voice carrying new authority as he worked with Sarah to prioritize the wounded. Major, we have 12 wounded requiring immediate medical attention and 3 Kia. Shadow Flight is requesting landing zone preparation and defensive overwatch during evacuation. Sarah's response demonstrated the kind of battlefield leadership that had earned her promotion to Major in Special Operations. Prepare Landing Zone Alpha for immediate use. All available personnel to provide security during evacuation. Priority goes to critical casualties first, then walk-in wounded. We'll hold this position until everyone is safely evacuated. The evacuation proceeded with military precision, the wounded soldiers being loaded aboard helicopters that had risked everything to reach the isolated base. The medical teams worked with practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated by Sarah's tactical guidance and Thompson's logistical expertise. The base that had been cut off and surrounded was now receiving the kind of support that came from having connections to forces that operated beyond conventional military channels. Foster supervised the weapons and ammunition resupply, her artillery training evident in the way she coordinated the complex logistics of restocking a base that had expended most of its defensive capabilities during the night-long battle. Major, Shadow Flight is providing enough ammunition to restore our defensive posture, but they're also bringing personnel who apparently have orders to debrief you about the intelligence operation. The debriefing team that arrived with the resupply helicopters carried the kind of authority that made even seasoned soldiers stand at attention. Their leader, a colonel whose uniform bore no unit insignia, approached Sarah with the bearing of someone who had spent years in the shadow world of special operations. His presence at Forward Operating Base Millfield was both validation of Sarah's mission and indication of how important her intelligence gathering had been. Major Chun, I'm Colonel Harrison from Task Force Dragon. Your intelligence on the Taliban network has been invaluable, but recent events have necessitated a change in operational security. We need to discuss your next assignment and the disposition of your cover identity. Sarah looked around the communications bunker that had been her world for 8 months, seeing the faces of soldiers who had discovered that their quiet radio operator was someone entirely different from who they had thought she was. The revelation had changed everything, but the relationship she had built and the trust she had earned were real, even if her identity had been carefully constructed. Rivera approached with the hesitant manner of someone who still wasn't sure how to address a superior officer who had been masquerading as a subordinate. "Major, before you leave, I need to know something. The training you provided to our communications staff, the improvements you made to our defensive procedures, were those part of your cover, or were you actually trying to help us?" Sarah's response carried the weight of someone who had spent months walking the line between deception and genuine care for the soldiers around her. "Lieutenant, everything I taught your people was real. The improvements to your communications procedures, the tactical guidance, the emergency protocols, all of that was designed to make this base more effective and to keep your soldiers alive. My cover identity required me to be helpful, but my commitment to your mission was genuine." The confession created a moment of understanding between Sarah and the soldiers who had served alongside her without knowing her true identity. The quiet radio operator who had worked the night shift had been protecting them all along, her vigilance and expertise serving as an invisible shield against threats they had never suspected. Thompson stepped forward, his weathered face showing the kind of respect that came from recognizing true competence. "Major, I owe you an apology. I dismissed you as someone who had been demoted and sent to a backwater assignment. I never imagined that you were actually here on a mission that was more important than anything the rest of us were doing." The evacuation and resupply operations continued as Sarah prepared to transition from her cover identity back to her real role in special operations. The soldiers of Forward Operating Base Millfield worked alongside the mysterious personnel from Task Force Dragon, their shared combat experience creating bonds that transcended questions of unit affiliation or security clearance. Foster coordinated the final phases of the base's defensive restoration, her voice carrying new confidence as she worked with personnel who had proven their competence under the most difficult circumstances. "Major Chun, before you leave, I want you to know that your tactical guidance saved this base. We were about to be overrun when you took control of the defense. I don't know what your next mission will be, but I hope it involves training other officers in the kind of leadership you demonstrated tonight." The morning sun broke through the dissipating storm clouds, illuminating Forward Operating Base Millfield in the golden light of a new day. The base that had been surrounded and outnumbered had not only survived, but had inflicted a devastating defeat on enemy forces that had expected easy victory. The transformation from desperate last stand to tactical victory had been orchestrated by someone whose real identity had been hidden in plain sight. Colonel Harrison approached Sarah with orders that would determine the next phase of her career. "Major, Task Force Dragon has new assignments available, but given your performance here, you also have the option of requesting a permanent assignment to train communications and intelligence personnel. Your combination of technical expertise and tactical leadership is exactly what we need for the next generation of special operations officers." Sarah looked around the communications bunker one final time, seeing the equipment that had been her constant companion for 8 months and the faces of soldiers who had discovered that their quiet colleague was actually their protector. The decision she made would determine not only her own future, but the legacy she would leave behind. Private Martinez, the young soldier who had worked the day shift and asked questions about the equipment, stepped forward with the kind of courage that came from having survived combat alongside someone he respected. "Major, I know this isn't my place, but I want to thank you for teaching me about the communication systems. You always took time to explain things, even when you didn't have to. That training helped me stay alive tonight." The moment crystallized. Everything that Sarah had experienced during her 8 months at Forward Operating Base Millfield. She had come to gather intelligence on enemy networks, But she had also found herself genuinely caring about the soldiers who had become her unwitting colleagues. The mission had been completed, but the relationships she had built were real and lasting. "Private Martinez," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who had found unexpected meaning in an assignment that had begun as pure duty. "Your curiosity and dedication to learning made you one of the best communications operators I've ever worked with. Whatever happens next, remember that technical expertise combined with tactical thinking can make the difference between life and death." The helicopters prepared for departure, their rotors spinning up as the evacuation and resupply operations reached completion. Sarah gathered her personal equipment, the same gear she had carried for 8 months while maintaining her cover identity. The transformation from radio operator to special operations major was complete, but the lessons learned and relationships forged would continue to influence her career. Thompson coordinated the final security sweep, his voice carrying new authority as he worked with personnel who had proven their competence under the most difficult circumstances. "Major, forward Operating Base Millfield will never be the same. After tonight, your presence here, your training, and your leadership have changed how we think about communications and intelligence operations." The legacy that Sarah left behind was more than just improved procedures and better equipment. She had demonstrated that true leadership came from competence and genuine care for subordinates, not from rank or position. The soldiers who had worked alongside her without knowing her real identity had learned lessons about professionalism and dedication that would influence their entire careers. Foster approached with the final casualty and equipment reports, her face showing the satisfaction of someone who had successfully defended her position against overwhelming odds. "Major Chun, the official after-action report will reflect your tactical guidance and leadership during the battle. But more importantly, every soldier who served here tonight knows that you were the difference between victory and defeat." The morning light revealed the full extent of the battlefield. The enemy positions on the ridgeline reduced to smoking craters by the precision airstrikes that Sarah had coordinated. The Taliban fighters who had expected to overrun an isolated outpost had instead encountered a defense that had been months in the preparation, guided by intelligence that they had never suspected existed. Colonel Harrison signaled for departure, the helicopters waiting to carry Sarah away from the base that had been her world for 8 months. "Major, Task Force Dragon has prepared your next assignment, but the choice of accepting it is yours. Your performance here has opened opportunities that most officers never receive." Sarah looked one final time at forward Operating Base Millfield, seeing the concrete structures and defensive positions that had withstood the night's assault. The base would continue its mission of border security and intelligence gathering. But the soldiers who served there would carry with them the knowledge that their quiet radio operator had been something extraordinary. Rivera approached with the formal bearing of someone who had learned valuable lessons about leadership and the importance of recognizing competence regardless of its source. "Major, I want to request that you consider returning to train other young officers. The lessons you taught tonight about tactical thinking and crisis leadership are exactly what the next generation needs to learn." The request carried weight because it came from someone who had experienced firsthand the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical expertise. Sarah's guidance had transformed a panicked young officer into someone who could make life and death decisions under pressure, a transformation that would influence his entire career. "Lieutenant Rivera," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who had found unexpected satisfaction in teaching. "Your willingness to learn and adapt under pressure shows that you have the potential to become an excellent commander. Remember that leadership is about serving your soldiers, not commanding them." The helicopters lifted off in formation, carrying Sarah away from forward Operating Base Millfield as the sun climbed higher in the clear mountain sky. The storm had passed, revealing a world transformed by the night's events. Below, the base that had been surrounded and outnumbered continued its mission. But the soldiers who served there would never forget the night when their radio operator revealed herself to be their salvation. Thompson watched the helicopters disappear into the distance, his weathered face showing the kind of respect that came from recognizing true competence. "She was never just a radio operator," he said quietly to Rivera. "She was exactly what this base needed, exactly when we needed her." The story of Major Sarah Chun would become legend among the soldiers who served at Forward Operating Base Millfield, passed down through changes of command and rotations of personnel. The quiet woman who had worked the night shift had demonstrated that true strength came from competence and genuine care for others, not from rank or recognition. Years later, when new soldiers arrived at the base, they would hear about the night when their radio operator saved everyone's life by revealing herself to be something far more extraordinary than anyone had imagined. The communications bunker would be maintained as a testament to the importance of vigilance and the power of hidden expertise. The legacy lived on in improved procedures, better training, and a deep respect for the technical specialists who maintained the electronic lifelines that connected isolated outposts to the larger military network. Sarah's influence extended far beyond the single night when she had revealed her true identity, creating a culture of excellence that would protect future generations of soldiers. The mountains surrounding Forward Operating Base Millfield returned to their eternal silence, but the lessons learned during the storm would echo through the careers of every soldier who had served there. Sometimes the most important person in the room was the one whose true capabilities remained hidden until the moment when everything depended on their expertise. 3 months after the battle that had changed everything at Forward Operating Base Millfield, the communications bunker bore little resemblance to the cramped, utilitarian space where Sarah Chun had spent 8 months maintaining her cover identity. The equipment had been upgraded with systems that officially didn't exist, and the tactical displays now showed intelligence feeds that transformed the isolated outpost into a crucial node in the larger network of mountain surveillance operations. Lieutenant Rivera, now promoted to captain after his performance during the Taliban assault, stood before a group of newly arrived communications specialists, his bearing reflecting the confidence that came from having survived combat under the guidance of someone whose expertise had saved everyone's life. The young officer who had once struggled with the complexities of command now spoke with the authority of someone who had learned leadership lessons that couldn't be taught in any academy. "The woman who worked in this bunker taught us that technical competence combined with tactical thinking creates capabilities that exceed the sum of their parts," Rivera explained to the assembled specialists, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won experience. "She demonstrated that understanding your equipment is only the beginning. The real skill comes from knowing how to use that knowledge to protect the people who depend on you." Private Martinez, now wearing corporal stripes and serving as the senior communications specialist, operated the upgraded equipment with the confidence that came from months of intensive training under Sarah's guidance. His questions had evolved from basic technical curiosity to sophisticated tactical applications, and his understanding of signal intelligence had grown to match his enthusiasm for the work. "The Major always said that every transmission tells a story," Martinez explained to a new arrival who was struggling with the complexity of the frequency analysis systems. "You have to learn to read between the lines, to understand what people aren't saying as much as what they are. The enemy doesn't announce their intentions, but they reveal them through patterns and procedures." The tactical map on the main display showed a network of enemy positions that had been identified through months of patient signal intelligence work, each contact verified through multiple sources and cross-referenced with human intelligence reports from throughout the region. The database that Sarah had begun during her cover assignment had grown into a comprehensive picture of Taliban operations across 3 provinces. Captain Foster, now serving as the base's executive officer after distinguishing herself during the battle, coordinated with intelligence analysts whose security clearances exceeded those of most field commanders. The artillery officer who had once focused solely on providing fire support now understood the broader implications of intelligence operations and their impact on regional security. The intelligence network that Major Chun established here has identified and neutralized 17 Taliban cells operating in this sector. Foster briefed a visiting delegation from headquarters, her voice carrying the pride of someone who had been part of something larger than herself. The procedures she developed for signal analysis and tactical coordination have been adopted by forward operating bases throughout the theater of operations. The bunker that had once housed a single radio operator working in isolation now served as a training center for communication specialists who would carry Sarah's techniques to other remote outposts. The equipment hummed with activity as instructors demonstrated the signal analysis procedures that had proven so effective during the night battle. Their lessons built on foundations that Sarah had laid during her months of patient work. Sergeant Thompson, his weathered face showing the respect that came from recognizing true competence regardless of its source, supervised the training with the dedication of someone who had learned the value of technical expertise through nearly losing everything he was responsible for protecting. His initial skepticism about Sarah's capabilities had been replaced by evangelical enthusiasm for the procedures she had developed. Every student who passes through this facility learns the fundamentals that Major Chen established, Thompson explained to a group of senior NCOs who had come to observe the training program. We teach them that communications is not just about relaying messages. It's about understanding the tactical picture, anticipating enemy actions, and providing the intelligence that commanders need to make life and death decisions. The success of the training program had attracted attention from levels of command that rarely concerned themselves with individual forward operating bases. Senior officers whose stars carried the weight of theater-level responsibility had visited the facility to understand how a single communications operator had transformed a routine intelligence mission into a tactical victory that had decimated an entire enemy network. Colonel Harrison, Sarah's former commander from Task Force Dragon, arrived without fanfare for what had become a quarterly assessment of the program's effectiveness. His presence validated the importance of what Sarah had accomplished, but his quiet demeanor reflected the operational security requirements that still surrounded many aspects of her mission. The techniques developed here have applications that extend far beyond this particular theater of operations, Harrison explained to Rivera during a private briefing session. Major Chun's integration of signal intelligence with tactical operations has become a model for forward-deployed units operating in similar environments worldwide. The transformation of Forward Operating Base Millfield from an isolated outpost to a crucial intelligence node had been gradual but undeniable. The base that had once struggled to maintain basic communications now served as a hub for operations that spanned multiple countries and involved assets that remained classified at the highest levels of government. Martinez supervised the installation of new equipment that arrived without documentation or manufacturer's markings, his technical expertise having grown to encompass systems that few soldiers would ever see. The young man who had asked basic questions about radio procedures now understood the intricacies of signals intelligence at a level that qualified him for assignments that would have been unimaginable before. Sarah's influence, she taught us. That curiosity was more important than rank, Martinez explained to a new group of students who had arrived for the Advanced Communications course. The person asking questions is often closer to understanding the real situation than the person giving orders. Never stop trying to learn, because the moment you think you know everything is the moment you become vulnerable. The lessons that Sarah had taught extended beyond technical procedures to encompass leadership principles that influenced every aspect of base operations. The culture she had established through her example continued to shape how personnel approached their duties, creating an environment where competence was valued over position and where genuine expertise was recognized regardless of its source. Foster coordinated with intelligence agencies whose acronyms were redacted from most reports, her artillery background having evolved to encompass the kind of strategic thinking that Sarah had demonstrated during the Taliban assault. The officer, who had once focused on immediate tactical problems, now understood the broader implications of intelligence operations and their impact on regional stability. The network analysis techniques that we learned here have been instrumental in disrupting enemy operations throughout the region, Foster reported during a secure video conference with officials whose faces remained pixelated for security reasons. The ability to identify command relationships through communications patterns has given us unprecedented insight into how these organizations operate and how they can be neutralized. The success stories accumulated in classified databases that documented the effectiveness of Sarah's methods. Taliban cells that had operated with impunity for years found themselves systematically dismantled as their communications were intercepted, analyzed, and used to predict their movements. The intelligence that flowed from forward Operating Base Millfield had become crucial to operations that spanned multiple theaters and involved resources that dwarfed the modest outpost where it all began. Rivera reviewed the monthly intelligence summaries that documented the continued effectiveness of the procedures Sarah had established. His understanding of the broader strategic picture, having grown through months of working with assets that operated beyond conventional military channels. The young officer who had once been overwhelmed by the complexity of a single base now coordinated operations that influenced policy decisions at the highest levels of government. The major always emphasized that intelligence without action was just expensive data collection. Rivera explained to a delegation of visiting officers who had come to study the base's success. She taught us that the real value comes from turning information into tactical advantage, from understanding enemy intentions well enough to disrupt them before they can achieve their objectives. The communications bunker had become a shrine to the kind of quiet professionalism that Sarah had embodied during her months of cover assignment. New personnel learned not just technical procedures, but the underlying philosophy that had made those procedures effective. The emphasis on continuous learning, attention to detail, and genuine care for the mission created an environment where excellence became the standard rather than the exception. Thompson supervised the graduation ceremony for the latest class of communications specialists, his pride evident as he watched young soldiers demonstrate mastery of techniques that Sarah had developed through years of operational experience. The gruff sergeant who had once dismissed technical expertise now served as its most effective advocate, having learned through near disaster the value of understanding what the equipment could really accomplish. These procedures save lives, Thompson told the graduating class, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen the consequences of both competence and failure. The person monitoring these frequencies might be the only thing standing between their fellow soldiers and an enemy who thinks they have the advantage of surprise. That responsibility is not something to take lightly. The impact of Sarah's work extended beyond the immediate tactical success of defending forward Operating Base Millfield. Her methods had been incorporated into training programs at military schools worldwide, and her emphasis on integrating technical expertise with tactical thinking had influenced doctrine development at the highest levels of military education. Martinez, now qualified as an instructor himself, worked with students whose security clearances allowed them access to the full scope of what Sarah had accomplished during her cover assignment. The young NCO, who had started as an eager student, had become a teacher whose understanding of signals intelligence rivaled that of career intelligence professionals. The major showed us that technology is only as good as the person using it, Martinez explained during an advanced seminar on tactical communications. She could make equipment do things that the manufacturers never intended because she understood not just how it worked, but why it worked that way. That kind of knowledge comes from curiosity, patience, and the willingness to keep learning even when you think you already know enough. The legend of the night battle had grown in the telling, but the core truth remained unchanged. A single person with the right knowledge and the courage to act had transformed a potential disaster into a tactical victory that resonated throughout the intelligence community. The story served as inspiration for personnel who worked in isolation, demonstrating that individual competence could have strategic impact when applied at the right moment. Foster coordinated with agencies whose missions remained classified decades after their completion, her understanding of intelligence operations having grown to encompass the kind of strategic thinking that influenced policy at the national level. The artillery officer who had once focused on immediate tactical problems now participated in planning sessions that shaped how this military approached unconventional warfare. The integration of technical intelligence with operational planning that we learned here has become a model for forward-deployed units worldwide, Foster reported during a classification briefing session. The ability to understand enemy intentions through communications analysis has transformed how we approach defensive operations in remote locations. The visitors who came to study the procedures that Sarah had developed often left with more questions than answers, but they carried with them an understanding of how individual excellence could create effects that far exceeded its apparent scope. The transformation of forward operating Base Millfield from an isolated outpost to a crucial intelligence node served as proof that the right person in the right place could change the strategic balance in ways that conventional force structure never could. Rivera, now being considered for promotion to major himself, coordinated operations that spanned multiple time zones and involved assets that remained classified at levels requiring special access programs. The young officer who had once struggled with the complexity of commanding a single base now participated in strategic planning sessions that influenced how the military approached irregular warfare. She taught us that understanding the enemy is more important than outgunning them, Rivera explained to a group of field-grade officers who had come to study the base's transformation. The ability to predict enemy actions through intelligence analysis gives you advantages that no amount of firepower can provide. When you know what they're going to do before they do it, you control the battle regardless of who has more soldiers or better equipment. The legacy continued to evolve as new personnel brought their own expertise to bear on the procedures that Sarah had established. The foundation she had laid proved robust enough to support innovations that even she might not have anticipated. But the core principles remained unchanged: technical competence, tactical thinking, and genuine dedication to the mission created capabilities that exceeded the sum of their parts. Thompson supervised the establishment of additional training facilities at other forward operating bases, his expertise in Sarah's methods making him a valuable asset for expanding the program to other locations. The sergeant who had once been skeptical of technical innovation now served as its most effective advocate, having learned through experience the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Every base that implements these procedures becomes more effective at its primary mission, Thompson explained to a group of senior NCOs who were preparing to establish similar programs at their own locations. The intelligence capabilities that Major Chun developed here don't replace traditional military skills. They enhance them, giving commanders the information they need to use their resources more effectively. The months that followed Sarah's departure had proven that her influence extended far beyond her physical presence. The procedures she had developed continued to evolve. The personnel she had trained became instructors themselves, and the culture of excellence she had established became self-sustaining. The transformation of forward operating base Millfield demonstrated that individual competence, properly applied, could create institutional change that persisted long after the individual moved on to other assignments. Foster coordinated the establishment of a formal doctrine based on Sarah's methods, her artillery background having evolved to encompass the kind of strategic thinking that influenced how the military approached intelligence operations in remote locations. The officer who had once focused solely on providing fire support now participated in doctrine development that would shape military education for generations. The procedures developed here represent a fundamental shift in how we think about intelligence operations at the tactical level. Foster explained during a doctrine development conference attended by officers whose responsibilities spanned multiple combatant commands. The integration of signals intelligence with tactical operations provides commanders with capabilities that were previously available only at much higher levels of command. The success of the program had attracted interest from civilian agencies whose missions intersected with military intelligence operations. The techniques that Sarah had developed for understanding enemy communications patterns had applications that extended far beyond the military sphere, and the training program at Forward Operating Base Millfield had become a model for interagency cooperation in developing new analytical methods. Martinez supervised the training of personnel whose security clearances required special access programs, his understanding of signals intelligence having grown to encompass techniques that few people outside the intelligence community would ever learn. The young soldier who had started by asking basic questions about radio equipment now taught advanced courses in tactical intelligence that influenced how the military approached unconventional warfare. She showed us that the most important intelligence often comes from understanding what's not being said, Martinez explained during an advanced course in communications analysis. Enemy forces reveal as much through their silence as they do through their transmissions. Learning to read those patterns requires patience, technical knowledge, and the kind of intuitive understanding that comes from years of experience. The transformation of Forward Operating Base Millfield had become a case study taught at military schools worldwide, but the personnel who had lived through the experience understood that the real lessons went beyond technical procedures. Sarah had demonstrated that excellence was not about recognition or advancement, but about serving something larger than oneself with the kind of quiet competence that made everyone around you better. Rivera coordinated with intelligence agencies whose missions required the kind of tactical flexibility that Sarah's methods enabled. His understanding of strategic operations having grown through months of working with assets that operated at the highest levels of classification. The young officer who had once been overwhelmed by a single crisis now participated in planning operations that influenced regional stability across multiple theaters. The night she revealed her real identity changed how all of us thought about our responsibilities. Rivera reflected during a leadership seminar attended by officers being prepared for command positions. She taught us that true leadership is about enabling others to succeed, not about taking credit for their achievements. The best leaders create environments where excellence becomes natural rather than exceptional. The years that followed would see the procedures Sarah had developed spread throughout the military and beyond, influencing how intelligence operations were conducted in locations from Arctic surveillance stations to desert outposts. The foundation she had laid at Forward Operating Base Millfield proved capable of supporting innovations that extended her influence far beyond what she could have accomplished alone. Thompson supervised the graduation of his 100th class of communication specialists, his pride evident as he watched young soldiers demonstrate mastery of techniques that had saved countless lives in the years since Sarah's departure. The gruff sergeant had become the keeper of her legacy, ensuring that each new generation understood not just the procedures, but the philosophy that made them effective. She was never just a radio operator, Thompson said during the graduation ceremony, his weathered face showing the respect that came from understanding true competence. She was a teacher, a leader, and a guardian who protected us all by doing her job better than anyone thought possible. The techniques you've learned here carry her influence forward, and through your work, her impact will continue to grow. The story of Major Sarah Chun had become legend, but the personnel who had served with her understood that the most important part of that legend was not the dramatic night when she revealed her true identity. It was the 8 months of quiet, professional competence that had preceded that revelation, the daily dedication to excellence that had prepared her to act when action was needed most. Foster coordinated the establishment of the Sarah Chun Center for Tactical Intelligence, a formal recognition of her contributions that ensured her methods would be preserved and developed for future generations. The center served not just as a training facility, but as a symbol of how individual excellence could create institutional change that persisted across decades. Her legacy is not about what she accomplished in a single night, Foster explained during the center's dedication ceremony. It's about demonstrating that competence and dedication, applied consistently over time, create the foundation for extraordinary achievement when extraordinary achievement is needed. She showed us that the most important victories are often won by people whose names never appear in headlines. The influence continued to spread as personnel, trained in Sarah's methods, carried her techniques to assignments worldwide. The quiet revolution she had started in a remote communications bunker now influenced operations from the Pentagon to forward operating bases in regions where conflicts remained classified decades after their resolution. Martinez, now a senior instructor with students whose careers would span multiple decades, taught advanced courses that bore little resemblance to the basic radio procedures he had learned as a young private. His understanding of intelligence operations had grown to encompass strategic thinking that influenced policy development at the highest levels of government. She taught us that excellence is not about being perfect, Martinez explained to his students during a seminar on leadership in technical fields. It's about being consistently good enough that when the critical moment arrives, you're ready to be exceptional. That kind of readiness comes from daily practice, continuous learning, and genuine care for the mission and the people who depend on you. The transformation that had begun with a single radio operator in a remote mountain outpost had created ripple effects that continued to influence military operations worldwide. The procedures, techniques, and philosophy that Sarah had developed proved adaptable to situations and technologies that hadn't existed when she first arrived at Forward Operating Base Millfield. Rivera, now wearing oak leaves and commanding a regiment whose operations spanned multiple countries, applied the lessons he had learned to challenges that would have seemed impossible during his early days as a lieutenant. The strategic thinking that Sarah had demonstrated during a single night of crisis had become a foundation for approaching complex problems with the kind of systematic analysis that turned impossible situations into manageable challenges. She showed us that the most important question is not whether you can solve a problem. Rivera reflected during a command conference attended by officers whose responsibilities influenced military policy at the national level. The important question is whether you understand the problem well enough to know what kind of solution is needed. That understanding comes from technical competence, tactical experience, and the wisdom to recognize that the best solutions often come from sources you didn't expect. The legacy lived on in procedures that saved lives, techniques that prevented conflicts, and a culture of excellence that made extraordinary performance seem routine. The quiet radio operator who had worked the night shift at a remote mountain outpost had created changes that influenced how the military approached intelligence operations. But more importantly, she had demonstrated that individual competence and dedication could create effects that exceeded any reasonable expectation of what one person could accomplish. The mountains surrounding Forward Operating Base Millfield returned to their eternal silence, but the lessons learned during the storm continued to echo through the careers of every soldier who had been touched by Sarah's influence. The story had become larger than the events that created it, but the truth at its core remained simple and powerful. Sometimes the most important person in the room is the one whose capabilities remain hidden until the moment when everything depends on their expertise. Years later, as new threats emerged and new technologies transformed the nature of warfare, the principles that Sarah had demonstrated remained relevant and powerful. The integration of technical expertise with tactical thinking, the emphasis on continuous learning, and the understanding that true leadership meant enabling others to succeed, created a foundation that proved adaptable to challenges that couldn't have been imagined when the story began. The communications bunker at Forward Operating Base Millfield had been upgraded countless times, but it remained a testament to the power of individual excellence applied with consistency and dedication. New personnel learned not just procedures but philosophy, not just techniques but character, and in doing so they carried forward an influence that would continue to shape military operations for generations to come. 5 years had passed since the night that transformed Forward Operating Base Millfield from an isolated mountain outpost into a cornerstone of intelligence operations spanning 3 continents. The concrete bunker where Major Sarah Chen had maintained her cover identity as a quiet radio operator had been replaced by a sophisticated facility that served as the nerve center for operations, whose scope would have been unimaginable when the story began. Brigadier General Marcus Rivera stood at the panoramic windows of the Pentagon briefing room, his stars reflecting the fluorescent lighting as he prepared to address a gathering of senior intelligence officials whose combined security clearances represented the highest levels of national security access. The young lieutenant who had once struggled with commanding a single forward operating base now coordinated operations that influenced policy decisions affecting global stability. The Chun protocols have been implemented at over 200 installations worldwide, Rivera reported to the assembled officials, his voice carrying the confidence that came from years of applying lessons learned a single night of crisis. The integration of tactical intelligence with operational planning has transformed how we approach asymmetric warfare in remote locations where conventional support structures are unavailable. The transformation that had begun with Sarah's patient intelligence gathering in the mountains of Afghanistan had evolved into a comprehensive doctrine that influenced military education at every level. Staff colleges taught case studies based on her methods, and newly commissioned officers learned tactical principles that originated in the quiet professionalism she had demonstrated while maintaining her cover identity. Colonel Anthony Martinez, now serving as the director of the Advanced Communications Intelligence School, supervised training programs that produced specialists whose capabilities exceeded those of intelligence professionals from previous generations. A young private who had asked eager questions about radio equipment had become one of the military's foremost experts in tactical signal analysis, his curriculum vitae reflecting assignments that remained classified at the highest levels. Every student who graduates from this program carries forward techniques that Major Chun developed through years of operational experience, Martinez explained to a delegation of international observers who had come to study the American approach to tactical intelligence. We teach them that technology is only as effective as the person using it, and that understanding the human element behind enemy communications is often more important than breaking their encryption. The success stories accumulated in databases that documented the effectiveness of Sarah's methods across diverse operational environments. Terrorist cells that had operated with impunity for decades found themselves systematically dismantled as their communications were intercepted, analyzed, and used to predict their movements with accuracy that approached precognition. The intelligence techniques that had saved Forward Operating Base Millfield during a Taliban assault had proven equally effective against threats, ranging from cyber warfare specialists to maritime pirates. Command Sergeant Major Jacob Thompson, his weathered face now bearing the kind of respect that came from decades of service at the highest levels, supervised the establishment of training facilities whose graduates carried Sarah's influence to assignments that spanned from Arctic surveillance stations to desert counter-terrorism operations. The gruff NCO who had once dismissed technical expertise as secondary to traditional military skills had become the most effective advocate for integrating intelligence capabilities with tactical operations. She showed us that the most dangerous enemy is the one who thinks they understand your capabilities. Thompson explained during the senior leadership conference attended by command sergeants major from every major command. Major Chun's approach was to let opponents reveal their intentions through their own communications while maintaining perfect operational security about our ability to understand what they were telling us. The doctrine that emerged from Sarah's work emphasized the importance of patience and systematic analysis over dramatic gestures and immediate results. Intelligence operations that might have been rushed to completion in previous eras were now allowed to develop over months or years, building comprehensive pictures of enemy networks that enabled surgical disruption of their capabilities rather than temporary tactical victories. Major General Amy Foster, her artillery background having evolved into expertise in strategic intelligence operations, coordinated with agencies whose missions remained so highly classified that their existence was acknowledged only through budget line items that appeared in documents requiring special access clearances. The officer who had once focused on providing immediate fire support now influenced how the United States approached intelligence cooperation with allies whose democratic institutions required careful protection from authoritarian threats. The network analysis techniques that originated at Forward Operating Base Millfield have been instrumental in disrupting hostile intelligence operations, targeting democratic institutions worldwide, Foster reported during a classification briefing that would remain sealed for decades. The ability to identify command relationships through communications patterns has given us capabilities that our adversaries don't know we possess and can't effectively counter. The strategic implications of Sarah's work extended far beyond the tactical success of defending a single base. Her emphasis on understanding enemy communications patterns had influenced how the intelligence community approached threats that operated across national boundaries and utilized technologies that transcended traditional military categories. Cyber warfare specialists learned techniques that originated in radio frequency analysis, while counter-terrorism operations applied principles that Sarah had developed for understanding Taliban tactical communications. Rivera coordinated operations that required approval from officials whose names appeared only in documents stored in facilities, whose locations remained classified decades after their construction. The young officer who had been overwhelmed by the responsibility of commanding 150 soldiers now participated in strategic planning sessions that influenced how democratic nations coordinated their response to authoritarian aggression. The integration of tactical intelligence with strategic planning that we learned from Major Chun has become fundamental to how we approach conflicts where traditional military superiority is offset by asymmetric tactics, Rivera explained during a strategic planning conference attended by officials whose responsibilities spanned multiple combatant commands. Understanding enemy intentions through communications analysis provides decision-makers with the kind of predictive intelligence that enables preventive action rather than reactive response. The personnel who had served with Sarah during her cover assignment had become the seeds of a transformation that influenced military culture at every level. Their understanding of how individual excellence could create strategic effects had made them effective advocates for programs that emphasized technical competence and systematic analysis over traditional measures of military effectiveness. Martinez supervised the development of artificial intelligence systems that automated many of the analytical processes that Sarah had performed manually, but the human insight that had made her methods effective remained irreplaceable. The technology enhanced human capabilities rather than replacing them, creating analytical tools that amplified the kind of intuitive understanding that came from years of experience with enemy communications patterns. The Major always emphasized that understanding comes from pattern recognition that develops over time. Martinez explained during the technical conference attended by engineers whose security clearances required polygraph examinations updated annually. Artificial intelligence can process data faster than any human, but it takes human insight to understand what the patterns mean in terms of enemy intentions and capabilities. The influence of Sarah's work had spread beyond the military into civilian agencies whose missions intersected with national security operations. The Federal Bureau of Investigation applied her techniques to domestic counterterrorism investigations, while the Central Intelligence Agency incorporated her methods into operations that remained classified under programs requiring special access clearances. Thompson coordinated the establishment of joint training programs that brought together personnel from military and civilian agencies, his expertise in Sarah's methods making him a valuable asset for developing interagency cooperation protocols. The sergeant who had learned the value of technical expertise through nearly losing everything he was responsible for protecting now taught courses that influenced how different agencies approached collaborative intelligence operations. The procedures that Major Chun developed work regardless of whether you're dealing with military threats or civilian criminal organizations, Thompson explained during an interagency training conference. The fundamental principle is the same. Understanding how your opponents communicate gives you insights into how they think, and understanding how they think allows you to predict what they're going to do. The years that followed Sarah's departure from forward Operating Base Millfield had proven that her influence extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation that had revealed her true identity. The procedures she had developed continued to evolve. The personnel she had trained became instructors themselves, and the culture of excellence she had established became self-sustaining across multiple organizations and agencies. Foster supervised the declassification of selected case studies that demonstrated the effectiveness of Sarah's methods without revealing operational details that remained sensitive. The careful balance between transparency and security required judgments that influenced how democratic societies protected their intelligence capabilities while maintaining public accountability for their use. The public has a right to understand that their government possesses capabilities that protect democratic institutions, Foster explained during a congressional briefing session. However, revealing the specific techniques that make those capabilities effective would enable hostile actors to develop countermeasures that would compromise our ability to detect and prevent threats to national security. The transformation that had begun with Sarah's quiet professionalism in a remote communications bunker had created ripple effects that continued to influence how democratic nations approached intelligence operations in an era when traditional distinctions between military and civilian threats had become increasingly meaningless. Rivera participated in strategic planning sessions that addressed threats ranging from state-sponsored cyber attacks to terrorist organizations utilizing social media for recruitment and coordination. The tactical thinking that Sarah had demonstrated during a single night of crisis had become a foundation for approaching complex problems that required systematic analysis and patient development of comprehensive solutions. She taught us that the most important intelligence often comes from understanding what's normal. Rivera reflected during a leadership conference attended by general officers whose responsibilities influenced military policy at the national level. You can't identify anomalies unless you understand baseline patterns, and you can't predict enemy actions unless you understand how they normally communicate and coordinate their activities. The legacy continued to evolve as new personnel brought their own expertise to bear on the procedures that Sarah had established. The foundation she had laid proved robust enough to support innovations that even she might not have anticipated. But the core principles remained unchanged: technical competence, systematic analysis, and genuine dedication to protecting democratic institutions created capabilities that exceeded the sum of their parts. Martinez supervised the training of personnel whose careers would span multiple decades of technological change, ensuring that Sarah's emphasis on understanding fundamental Principles rather than memorizing specific procedures would enable them to adapt to threats that hadn't yet been imagined. The young soldier who had learned the value of curiosity from Sarah now taught advanced courses that prepared intelligence professionals for careers that would influence national security for generations. Technology will continue to evolve, but the human elements that Major Chun taught us to focus on remain constant. Martinez explained during a futurist conference attended by officials responsible for long-term strategic planning. People communicate because they need to coordinate their activities, and coordination patterns reveal intentions regardless of what technology they use to accomplish their communication. The success of the programs that originated with Sarah's work had attracted attention from international partners whose own democratic institutions required protection from increasingly sophisticated authoritarian threats. NATO allies established training exchanges that spread her techniques throughout the alliance, while intelligence sharing agreements incorporated analytical methods that she had developed for understanding enemy communication patterns. Thompson coordinated the establishment of international training programs that brought together personnel from allied nations, his understanding of Sarah's methods making him an effective advocate for developing standardized approaches to tactical intelligence that transcended national boundaries and organizational cultures. Democracy requires cooperation between nations that share common values, Thompson explained during an international conference on intelligence cooperation. The techniques that Major Chun developed help us understand threats that operate across national boundaries and utilize technologies that don't respect traditional jurisdictional limitations. The strategic implications of Sarah's work continued to unfold as new threats emerged and existing threats adapted to countermeasures that had proven effective against their previous operational methods. The flexibility that she had built into her analytical approaches proved capable of adapting to situations that bore little resemblance to the mountain warfare environment where they had originated. Foster supervised the development of doctrine that addressed threats ranging from space-based weapons to biological warfare, her understanding of Sarah's principles enabling her to adapt tactical intelligence techniques to strategic challenges that required analysis of threats operating across multiple domains simultaneously. The integration of technical analysis with strategic thinking that we learned from Major Chun provides a framework for understanding complex threats, regardless of the specific technologies or tactics they employ, Foster explained during the Strategic Doctrine Conference. The fundamental approach remains the same: understand how they communicate, analyze their coordination patterns, and use that understanding to predict their intentions and capabilities. The transformation of American intelligence capabilities that had begun with Sarah's patient work in a remote communications bunker had influenced how democratic nations approach the protection of their institutions in an era when authoritarian threats operated through methods that transcended traditional military categories. Rivera coordinated responses to threats that required coordination between agencies whose missions had historically operated independently. His understanding of Sarah's integrative approach enabling him to develop collaborative frameworks that preserved operational security while maximizing analytical effectiveness. She showed us that the most effective response to complex threats requires integration of capabilities that were traditionally kept separate. Rivera reflected during a national security planning conference. Understanding enemy communications patterns requires technical expertise, but applying that understanding to protect democratic institutions requires strategic thinking that connects tactical intelligence to policy decisions. The influence of Sarah's work had become so thoroughly integrated into American intelligence operations that new personnel learned her techniques without necessarily understanding their historical origins. The procedures had become standard practice. The analytical approaches had been incorporated into training curricula, and the culture of excellence she had established had become the expected norm rather than an exceptional achievement. Martinez supervised the establishment of advanced research programs that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in communications intelligence. His understanding of Sarah's fundamental principles enabling him to guide development of capabilities that she could not have imagined when she was working with relatively primitive equipment in a mountain bunker. The Major's greatest contribution was not any specific technique or procedure, Martinez explained during a research conference attended by scientists whose work remained classified under programs requiring special access clearances. Her greatest contribution was demonstrating that human insight and technical capability, properly integrated, create analytical powers that exceed what either could accomplish independently. The decades that followed would see Sarah's influence continue to shape how democratic institutions protected themselves against threats that operated through methods that challenged traditional distinctions between military and civilian, foreign, and domestic, physical, and digital domains of conflict. Thompson coordinated the training of personnel whose careers would span technological revolutions that would transform the nature of warfare and intelligence operations in ways that could not be predicted, but could be prepared for through the kind of fundamental understanding that Sarah had emphasized throughout her career. The specific technologies will change, but the human need to communicate and coordinate will remain constant, Thompson explained during a strategic planning conference focused on preparing for technological changes that would influence national security for generations. Understanding those fundamental human patterns provides a foundation for adapting to whatever technological changes the future brings. The story of Major Sarah Chun had become more than a legend shared among intelligence professionals. It had become a foundational narrative that explained how individual excellence, properly applied and systematically developed, could create institutional changes that persisted across decades and influenced the protection of democratic values worldwide. Foster supervised the establishment of research programs that addressed threats that had not existed when Sarah worked her night shifts in the mountains of Afghanistan, but the analytical principles she had demonstrated proved applicable to challenges that transcended the specific technological and tactical environments where they had originated. Her legacy is not about what she accomplished during a single night of crisis. Foster reflected during a ceremony honoring intelligence professionals whose contributions had influenced national security. Her legacy is about demonstrating that excellence applied consistently over time creates the foundation for extraordinary achievement when extraordinary achievement is needed most. The mountains surrounding the location where forward Operating Base Millfield had once stood returned to their eternal silence, but the lessons learned during the storm continued to echo through the careers of thousands of personnel who had been influenced by Sarah's example. The quiet radio operator who had worked the night shift at a remote outpost had created changes that influenced how democratic nations protected their institutions, but more importantly, she had demonstrated that individual competence and dedication could create effects that exceeded any reasonable expectation of what one person could accomplish. The influence continued to spread as each new generation of intelligence professionals learned techniques that originated in Sarah's patient work, carried forward principles that she had demonstrated through her example, and applied lessons that she had taught through her dedication to excellence regardless of recognition or advancement. Years later, as new threats emerged and new technologies transformed the nature of intelligence operations, the principles that Sarah had demonstrated remained relevant and powerful. The integration of technical expertise with strategic thinking, the emphasis on understanding human patterns behind technological capabilities, and the recognition that protecting democratic institutions required both individual excellence and systematic cooperation created a foundation that proved adaptable to challenges that could not have been imagined when her story began. The communications equipment at facilities worldwide continued to hum with activity that bore Sarah's influence. But her greatest legacy was not technological or procedural. It was the demonstration that quiet competence, applied with consistency and dedication, could create changes that influence the protection of democratic values for generations of people who would never know her name but whose freedom was protected by the principles she had established and the culture of excellence she had created. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.